Joining us now for the strategy, the context, the analysis, former Biden White House press secretary and host of MSNBC's Inside with Jen Psaki, the one and only Jen Psaki. Really good to have you. I love having you on the show.
Great to be here, Katie. Great to be here with you always.
Let's talk about today. So you have President Biden trying to make a contrast with former President Trump, the man who said, I alone can fix it, versus the man who stood on that cliff today and said, no, it's about all of us working together. That message about saving democracy and not going at it alone is getting to a lot of voters. And there are a lot of voters who agree with him. But there are a lot of voters who are not seeing that as their number one issue. And those are the voters who are waffling or looking to Donald Trump. How does the Biden team counteract that?
Well, I think, and you touched on both of them, there were two big messages from this speech today for a domestic audience. One of them is kind of asking the public who is listening to hearken back to what our ideals are, what they've long been, back to the greatest generation. And that was obviously a clear theme in this speech. And democracy has mattered, as you said. It's not the number one issue for everybody, but it is a bigger issue than often we anticipate every time we're leading up to an election cycle. The second one is the other point you touched on, which is bigger than it's more expansive and in the moment than talking about the efforts of these of the allied forces who scaled that wall. It's about the fact that Joe Biden is saying, I am the guy who's going to fight for you, and I care about the ideals of our country and what matters to you. The other guy cares about himself. And that contrast, I think, is going to be, or it should be, Katie, a big, big, big continuing theme. I care about all of you. I'm fighting for you. He cares about fighting for himself. He's trying to keep himself out of jail. That's part of what I think, obviously, when he comes back from overseas, as Kelly said, and I completely agree with this, President Biden is not somebody who's going to do an overt political attack overseas, although people can hear what they want to hear, and that's intentional. But when he comes back, I think that's a big part of the theme. The other thing I would just add, just to harken back a little bit to history here, and I think this is part of also what he was trying to appeal to, is I read Reagan's speech from 40 years ago on D-Day this afternoon, because there's so many echoes of that. And part of what he says, Reagan, in that speech is, we're bound today by what bound us 40 years ago, the same loyalties, traditions, and beliefs. We're bound by reality. The strength of America's allies is vital to the United States, and the American security guarantee is essential to the continued freedom of Europe's democracies. It's important to remember that, because also what President Biden is doing is reminding people these values and these fundamentals of what he's talking about today are not partisan. They haven't historically or traditionally been partisan. They're part of who we are as a country. Ronald Reagan was long. Maybe he's not anymore. But the great example for kind of every Republican running for office. That's not the MAGA example. But what Ronald Reagan was saying in that speech 40 years ago could be intertwined with what President Biden was saying today. And I think that's an interesting part of his messaging as well.
Yeah, but, Reagan, that many years ago, had an easy way to get to American audiences. It was make that speech and every network would carry it.
That's true.
It would be in every newspaper, and that's where you'd get your information. Those were the outlets. Now, it's so diversified. I mean, you can go to us, you can go to broadcast news, you can go to the newspapers, but there's also Twitter and social media and whatever corner of the internet you like to go to find what you want to hear. So how do you break through that? How do you break through the people who maybe aren't going for the politics, but the people who are just not paying attention, period?
Well, it's certainly not just speeches, as historic and beautiful as that backdrop was today. I'm certainly not saying that. I mean, part of it is also empowering and engaging your supporters to be able to interact on all of those platforms you said. It's not just a messaging tool, all those social media platforms. They're an organizational tool. That's how the campaign is using it. But what I think should be a bit alarming to supporters of President Biden is how quickly Donald Trump built support on places like TikTok, right? Yeah. Because his supporters, his size is much, much bigger. Now, it's not just about size. It's also about the impact of the type of content you're doing. But that is where, especially, Katie, when we're talking about these double haters, as we're now all shorthanding, and the type of people that President Biden and the campaign needs to bring over to their side, needs to bring back home, some of them, or needs to even convince them to vote for him if they haven't voted for him before. They're younger, they're more diverse, they're less politically engaged, and they are not necessarily reading they're not reading the Reagan speech necessarily. Maybe some of them are. They're not consuming the same type of traditional news that, as you said, Ronald Reagan was communicating through. So they have to also communicate through those forces and use it as both a messaging tool, but also as a tool of engagement. That's what people expect on those platforms.
How do you think they're doing on that? I mean, I know that the Biden team sees this as an extremely important election, maybe the last election. And they're trying to run on that. They're trying to say, America, they got to take this seriously. This is no joke. Donald Trump wants to be a dictator. He said so, and he might not leave. How are they doing on making sure, because they don't want this to happen, making sure Donald Trump doesn't win again?
Well, it's very hard to gauge in the moment, right?
Yeah.
Because and it's hard for any of us to gauge, and we pay close attention to it, because a lot of what they're doing, and in a different way, what the Trump team is doing, is not seen every day, right? It's not every speech. It's not every public statement. It's a lot of the type of person-to-person organizing engagement that's happening on these platforms that's much harder to gauge if you're not doing it every single day. I will say they recognize, and I've talked to them about this, they have a very talented and smart team of people who are doing this. They've done a lot with these tools, even from many of the same people who were working in the White House when I was there, where you don't have money, you don't have funds to put money toward it, and you have to be creative and you have to think outside of the box and do that. That is where a lot of this race is going to be won or lost, is going to be how people communicate and how the campaigns communicate on those platforms. There are still big moments, Katie. I mean, obviously big speeches like today, we're all talking about it, but the debate coming up will be another moment that is like kind of a landing place that they'll do a lot of organizing from on these platforms. But it's very hard to gauge from kind of the seats we're sitting in this moment.
It is so hard to predict the future. Jen Psaki, always really good to have you. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.